Hello and welcome to the GoodPractice Podcast, a weekly show about work, performance and learning. I'm Ross Gardner and this is episode 117, Do We Have Evidence for Training's Impact? Around the globe, billions are spent on workplace training. Some people even do it for a living. But if you're one of those people, then you might be about to have an existential crisis. Or maybe not. Let's find out by introducing our special guest this week. From a small fast food operation based out of the US, it's Kevin Yates, Fact Finder for Learning and Development at McDonald's. Hello, Kevin.
Hello.
And from Good Practice, I'm joined by regular contributor Owen Ferguson. Hello, Owen.
Hello, Ross.
Kevin, I want to start this discussion with our episode title, Do We Have Evidence for Training's Impact? What do you think?
Absolutely, we have evidence. It is what I am evangelizing literally across the globe. There is evidence, there are facts, there is data, there are clues, and it all answers the question, did training work? So we definitely have ways in which we can get at the answer to that question. There are processes, there are methods that we can use so that there's proof that when we are delivering training and learning and professional development, that there is a difference in people's performance, that there is a difference in their behavior, and then most important, that those differences are somehow impacting business results. So yes, we definitely have evidence and data that there is impact for training, learning, and development.
I wonder how many of our listeners expected you to say no. Or why would this even be a question that's worth asking?
Yeah, well, there are different thoughts, right? So there are some that believe that just based on the nature of learning, that you can't always prove it. And I say not so. I believe that there is. And then there are some that believe and might even go so far as to say that it's not appropriate to measure the impact of learning because learning just is. And so to those, I say, there are ways in which we can be credible and we can be reliable. There are ways in which we can use facts and evidence and data that show whether or not learning is changing anything at all. So, I would have to defute any argument that says that there is no evidence or that we don't need evidence.
I think probably the trend that we hear a lot just now is that most of the evidence that you see is happy sheets, and it's about the trainer was nice and lunch was delicious and that kind of thing, and that kind of evidence is garbage. I guess the question is, what evidence should we be looking at?
Yeah, and that is an awesome point, a great point to bring up, because for me, the reality is that there are some smiley sheets that don't produce evidence and don't predict facts. So more often than not, that smiley sheet that you get at the end of a training program is going to ask you, did you like the instructor? Did you like the food? Did you like the classroom? And so none of that is about impact. And that really doesn't provide any facts or evidence about whether or not people's behavior or performance is going to change as a result of training or learning. So I do like to use post-program evaluations to forecast or predict the extent to which there will be a change in performance or a change in behavior. So I like to not use smiley sheets. I like to collect data that forecasts impact. So if you ask the right kinds of questions in a post-training evaluation, you can get the right kind of data that will help you forecast whether or not there's going to be a change. So, and I want to emphasize that it's a forecast because it is simply capturing the attitude and the thoughts of those who have just completed an experience, a learning experience. So while it just simply forecasts data for impact, it's a good predictor and it will help along the way as you are collecting all the facts about whether or not training will make a difference.
Well, I want to come back to forecasting in a minute, but you said that I made a good point, which of course I'm flattered by, but as you were saying it, Owen was frowning like he fundamentally disagreed. So, Owen, why were you frowning when I brought up happy sheets?
Because I don't think happy sheets are particularly useful. Kevin's absolutely right that there is evidence that training can have impact. So the example that I kind of tend to think about is if you take a sample of 100 people who have attended catering college and 100 people from the general public and ask them to cook a meal, I am willing to bet a mortgage that the meals prepared by those who've attended catering college are better. So training works in certain contexts, and yet there is failed training initiatives litter the world of learning and development where they've not had the intended impact, or they've not had an impact at all. So the question is, which context do they work in and for which domains? And what's interesting about what Kevin's saying is that you can predict the success of a training or a learning and development initiative from other metrics, and that's or certain metrics are good predictors of the eventual impact of learning and development initiatives, and that's really encouraging, because I think that causal link has been something that we've been missing in L&D, and part of the reason is because there's been this reliance on the happy sheets and how people's initial reactions to something. So it's encouraging to hear that there's other metrics that we can look at that are good predictors of performance.
Well, are there? I was wondering if we could go back to the forecasting point, Kevin, and if you could maybe explain what you mean by that and what that would look like in practice, and then I'll maybe try and tear down your straw man.
So here's how I will compare and contrast, right? So, again, the smiley sheet question usually asks something like, was the instructor helpful? So, for me, that is not so much an indicator of the extent to which someone's behavior is going to change or their performance is going to change. So in contrast, the type of question I would ask is, how much of what you've learned do you believe you can apply in your job day to day? And what I might use to measure that is a percentage scale. So is it 10% of what you learned? Is it 50% of what you've learned? Is it 80% of what you've learned? That is a good predictive measure to determine the extent to which behavior is going to change. Now, again, it's not a measure that tells us actually how much performance has changed, but I'd rather ask that kind of question than to ask someone, did they like the instructor? So for me, that's an example of a forecasting or a predictive measure. Does that make sense?
Yes, and now let me tear into it slightly, because I would bet that no one's going to say that their behavior is not going to change at all. And what's the value of that perception that they have?
Yep. So, and I would disagree with that, because I have seen training and learning development programs that were absolutely terribly delivered and that were seen as having no value. And so when asked the question, what percent of what you learned do you believe you'll apply? People will respond 0.
I wonder if that's a cultural thing. In Britain, we would never say 0.
Are you saying that you're a bit more polite?
Uptight, maybe, I think is another word for it.
And the important thing, though, you raise a good point, and that's why we want to do a percentage scale. So normally I'll do a percentage scale of 0% to 100%, and I'll do increments of 10. So if someone were to say, I'll apply 20% versus someone who says, I'll apply anywhere from 80 to 100%, what I'm getting is a sight into the range and the depth of breadth of where we can expect a performance change. So those who are on the lower scale are obviously going to see or are predicting a lower impact, whereas those who are on the higher scale are predicting a higher impact. So to your point, even if you don't want to indicate 0, if you're indicating a lower percent, then to me, that's an alarm. Does that make sense?
Yeah, you're not actually saying that they're going to be 20% better at X, but it's an indication that they don't perceive there's going to be an enormous benefit from the training that they've just been on.
That's exactly it. So what we're talking about here is just the forecasted impact of training or learning on their performance, right? And it is just a forecast. But again, if you're looking at training where the numbers are coming in lower, say anywhere from 50% and below, or maybe 40% and below, then again, that's a red flag. Then that means that you can, safely predict that there's not going to be any change as a result of that learning experience. But if you're saying the percentages come in higher, then that's where you can forecast or predict that, you can expect a performance change. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'm wondering how much those predictions come true.
Well, it depends because, again, what we're talking about now is just an initial forecast. And so after the learning experience, there are a lot of things that need to happen in order for performance to change and in order for behavior to change. So one of the things that people need, for example, is performance support, what a lot of people call learning transfer. So these are the things that help the learning to continue to go and grow even after someone leaves the learning experience or leaves the classroom. So you're right in that, after training or after learning, we have to continue to collect the facts and we have to continue to collect the data to determine the extent to which performance is actually changing on the job.
But it sounds, Kevin, like that what you're describing is almost a prerequisite, that even if you get all the things that happen after right, all that stuff to help with the transfer of learning into the workplace, if that initial metric, which, I mean, that's essentially a relevance metric, isn't it? Is this stuff relevant to your role? Is basically what you're asking. That if people don't see that connection, that they don't see that they will be able to apply it in their work, then no matter how good the support afterwards is, it's not going to happen.
Absolutely. And I want to be clear. What we're talking about now is just one fact. There are many, many, many facts and data and evidence that we need to gather and collect when we're trying to answer the question, did training work? So again, I don't want to put too much emphasis on a smiley sheet or a post-program learning evaluation, because again, for me, it is nothing more than a predictive or forecasting fact or forecasting data. There are more data and there are more facts and there's more evidence that we need to collect along the way. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I want to go back to that just in a second, but I'm conscious it's 5 o'clock in the morning where you are and I'm giving you quite a hard time. But I do worry that if you don't say at the outset how you're going to measure whatever the X intervention is going to be, we're going to have, I don't know, try and think of an example. Say a data protection course, something like that. You don't actually have any data protection problems. You're just doing it for the sake of it, but you do it in a really engaging way that really excites people. Then they might respond really positively and think, I'm never going to cause any kind of data protection breach or anything like that. But it doesn't really matter because there wasn't really a problem there in the first place. Do you see what I'm getting at? I wonder if it's having that kind of predictive questions, it's almost too late in the process to start that evaluation. Well,
actually, if I understand your question correctly, I think that what we're talking about is going to need to start even before we get to training, right?
Yeah,
so exactly. For me, when I'm having conversations about what's required in an organization to impact business results, the first thing I'm talking about are the performance requirements that are needed to achieve business goals and to achieve business results. So you just provided a great example of something where we want to be sure that in the learning and in the training experience, that the design is directly tied to whatever it is that the business is trying to achieve. Because for me, learning outcomes should lead to performance outcomes, and performance outcomes should drive business results. So if the learning experience is tightly tied and aligned to whatever the business goal is, then the instruction will be tied to that as well, so that when we take the facts and the evidence and the data from those predictive and forecasting measures that I just talked about, we're already measuring the extent to which the performance outcomes are going to line up to what the business goals are. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I kind of feel like I pushed you down the happy sheet road and then attacked you for it. Sorry about that. Let's assume that you have given some advice on how to improve the use of happy sheets, and that there's other evidence that we should be looking at.
And you know what? The other thing for me, I don't even like to use that term because...
No, it's a terrible term. It's a deliberately disparaging phrase.
And it leads back to the traditional use, right? And again, the traditional use is, did you like the instructor? Did you like the classroom? Did you like the food? That's a happy sheet. So I don't use happy sheets. What I use are learning evaluations that predict and or forecast the potential impact on performance for achieving the business goal.
Okay. What other evidence should we be looking for outside of those forecasting tools?
Yep. So the other thing that you want to take a look at is the data or the facts or the evidence for actual performance, right? So what you want to determine is the extent to which people are applying what they've learned in their day-to-day jobs, in their day-to-day roles, because that's where it happens, right? So if there was something that you learned, we want to collect some facts and some evidence and data to determine the extent to which in your day-to-day role, you're actually doing that. So, maybe you're a hospital worker, or maybe you are a restaurant worker, or maybe you're a salesperson. So the question is, for all those things that you learned, are you actually using them? Are you applying them? Are they impacting your behavior? Are they impacting your performance day to day? So that's where we want to collect performance data, and we want to collect facts and evidence about the way in which people are using what they learned in their roles and their jobs.
Yeah, and I think this is where it gets interesting, because if we're talking about what evidence we should be looking for, I'd suggest that that the data that we're collecting is far more contextual than we would like it to be. I think one of the things that these sort of L&D evaluation models is try and have one size fits all for how you collect the data, and that's not particularly helpful because you're looking for different things. So most L&D efforts are in support of some goal, but they are not necessarily always the key causal mechanism that results in improved performance. So if you look at most leadership development initiatives, they essentially say something like, we want to change the behavior of our leaders in order to improve performance. And there's two parts of that causal pathway. There's, did the behavior change in the way that we wanted it to? And following that, did that behavior change actually improve performance? Because you can have success in changing the behavior and still not improve the performance because the behavior that we thought was going to make a positive difference just didn't. And so in that situation, can you say, did the L&D intervention fail because it succeeded in changing the behavior? It's just that the behavior didn't have the impact that we thought it was going to. And so who was it that decided, well, we need to change the behavior in the first case? And who decided that we need to change it in this particular way? I'm thinking about things like, we need to have more of a coaching culture. Does that result in improved performance in the context of that particular organization? So when you're collecting evidence, you need to first of all say, did the thing that we do work in the way that we intended? I.e., did it change the behavior in the way that we intended? That's how we improve the initiatives that we do. And then second to that, did it actually improve performance? Did we change the behavior? Did the change occur that we wanted it to? And did that cause an improvement in performance? And that's difficult to do, and depending on what it is, what kind of behavior you're looking to change, it will impact on what kind of evidence you collect for that.
You also need to work out what you mean by performance as well. If you're going to have like a sales manager, for example, the performance might be a short-term spike in sales, but you piss off all of your sales team and they all resign, and then you need to hire, and that introduces recruitment costs and all that kind of thing. So performance is kind of it's too woolly a term, I think, for a lot of what we do.
Yeah, and you're both right. And there's a couple of things that come into play on what you're talking about. Because the reality, and I say it out loud, I'm not afraid to say it, it is often difficult to find facts, evidence, and data to determine the extent to which training or learning or professional development has made an impact. But difficult doesn't mean impossible, because it is possible. It's just difficult, particularly when you get to things like leadership, right? And where I believe people miss the opportunity is by not defining what leadership looks like. So often we just talk about leadership skills, leadership acumen, leadership capability. But for me, you have to define what leadership looks like. So how does leadership show up day to day? What does leadership look like when you are executing with leadership that is considered to be effective by the organization? So you actually have to describe the skill. You have to define the behavior. So if I'm looking at leadership, what does leadership look like? So the first thing that you have to do is describe the skill or capability specifically, because that skill capability will manifest itself in performance, and that's how you can describe it. The other thing that we have to do is isolate the impact of training. And I believe that this is the point that you were trying to make, Owen. So for me, training is not a silver bullet. So in any given instance, any given situation or circumstance, I have never seen an instance where training solved everything. And for me, I don't believe we ever will. So when we think about all the things that impacts a person's performance or all the things that impacts a person's capability, training is just one of those things. So we have to isolate all the other influences and impact that goes into that person's performance. I'll give you an example. Let's just say, for example, we want to help someone who is working in a call center improve his or her capability to resolve more calls at first level, right? So training may be a part of that. But the other thing that may be a part of that is the knowledge that that person has access to solve a customer's problem. The other thing might be the technology that a call center person has access to help a person solve that problem. So with the example that I just gave you, there are three influences. One is training, the other is a knowledge base, and the other is technology. So that's an example of where there are three things that are going to impact that person's performance. So again, just to summarize, for me, we have to describe specifically what a skill or behavior looks like so that we can see how it shows up in day-to-day performance. And we have to isolate the impact of training because training is not a silver bullet. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I was looking up in prep for this episode, organizations that had done randomized controlled trials on their training initiatives to see if I could find any papers about this. I did manage to find one in the Lancet about it was the fire service in Australia had done a randomized control trial on the impact of mental health training for their managers. So they had two groups, a treatment group and control group, and the treatment group got mental health training about how to spot signs of mental health trouble in your employees and what action to take, and the control group had the training deferred until after the trial. And it found that after 6 months, the managers who'd received the training didn't know any more than those who hadn't, but they were more confident communicating with their team about mental health. So that was their perception. That's maybe the forecasting point that you bring up, Kevin. But then they also had a metric which was work-related sick leave dropped for those employees whose managers had attended the training, suggesting that the managers were able to reduce absence by speaking to their team about mental health issues. There were a few quirky things with the study, I thought, one of which was that the p-value reported for the change was 0.049, which we've discussed before is very, very close to the cutoff for statistical significance. But it does show that it's possible for organizations to set up this kind of trial and try and isolate individual interventions to see how they perform.
Yeah, and you just talked about a method that I like to use whenever there is an opportunity to do so. And so when you can have a test group and a control group, I believe that gives you some fairly reliable data and some reliable facts about the extent to which people's behavior is going to change, or rather has changed, and the extent to which those changes that we expect are impacting some type of organization or business results. So when you're using test groups and control groups, I think that gives you a good base as you are trying to determine the extent to which, something is going to change as a result of training and learning. So I absolutely love test groups and control groups. Try to use them as often as I can.
It's also cheaper than rolling out a program to everyone that you don't know if it's going to work or not. Absolutely.
It's smart. I mean, if you have a learning and development initiative in your business that is going to, cost in upwards of, thousands or millions of dollars, before you make a huge investment, you want to have a way in which you have some facts that will show you'll be able to achieve what you want to achieve with that program or with that learning. So rolling something out and using test groups and control groups to kind of get some evidence is the smart thing to do, for sure.
Oh, it definitely is. I think, but there are lots of things that get in the way of people taking that approach. And some of it is driven by how the organizational leadership feels about it. So it is, I genuinely think in the long run, it is cheaper to do it that way, to have, to find out whether the thing that you're intending to do actually works or not. Because as I've mentioned on this podcast a few times before, there are broadly 3 possible outcomes to any kind of intervention. One is that it has a positive impact. Another is that it has no impact at all. The third is that, and it's the one that people don't necessarily always consider, is that it actually has a negative impact, that it has a detrimental impact on performance or the outcome that you're trying to achieve. And so what having a test and control group does is it protects you from that, as long as you are willing to not go ahead with an intervention if you find out that it doesn't work. So that's where the cost saving comes in. But by the time that you've got to the point where you can roll it out with a trial group, you've actually done 90% of the work to create the thing. And so it's really difficult for people to let go of that. And that's where the challenge comes in. I think if we're going to up our game in terms of using evidence to inform our practice, then we have to face up to the fact that some of the things that we're going to try out will not work, and we need to be brave enough to say we're not going to do that thing that we were planning to do because we found out that it didn't have the impact that we thought it was.
That's a perfect segue into a belief that I have. And so for me, when I think about collecting facts and evidence and data, I'm thinking that we shouldn't be afraid if the facts tell us something didn't work. We should be afraid if we don't do anything with the facts. So to your point, if the evidence shows that training didn't work, don't do it or stop, because it's not doing anything. It's a waste of time and it's a waste of money. So, you're spot on when you say that quite often there is resilience against not moving forward in something that we know isn't working just because we've already set forth the momentum to do it. But I say save time, save money, and stop doing damage and harm to people by providing some training that's not helping anyone at all.
It's the gambler's fallacy, isn't it? That you keep doubling down because eventually you will win it back. It is the brave L&D manager, though, that I'm picturing, that goes into their boss's office and says, we gave this intervention to 20% of the organization and we've lost $1 million because it had a negative impact, which means I've just saved you $4 million and I should be promoted.
That's right. And I like that example you gave, because you can't say something like that based on a gut feeling or, based on what you think or what you believe. You got to have some evidence for that. You got to have some facts for that. And so that's why engaging in these types of activities that we're describing that helps you collect those facts is ultimately going to help the business in the long run. And as a learning and development leader, if I have the facts and the evidence to back up my recommendation that we stop doing something that's not working, then I'm going to feel a lot more confident than just going in and say, I don't think this is working based on my gut feeling. Guys, I don't think this is working. Yeah, we want to make sure that we are supporting our chief learning officers and our learning development leaders with the facts and the evidence they need to make the best decisions for the businesses and organizations they serve. Yeah.
Final question. Do we need an L&D data analyst on our teams? Is that the level that we're getting to, that this is a full-time role for someone? For the listeners at home, Owen's rolling his eyes.
So that's an interesting question. And last year, just out of curiosity, I started to gather and collect the postings of roles that I was seeing for learning and development scientists, learning and development data analysts, learning and development measurement specialists. And I'm starting to see an emergence of a role for L&D that is very different than what I've seen before. And I've been in L&D for more years than I want to say. But what I will say is that in these role descriptions, they are asking for skill sets like, data science and different types of data modeling and different types of software that statisticians use, that they use. So, I'll just go so far as to say, I see the value in having someone on a learning and development team who has that kind of skill set. I think that they can be very valuable when it comes to taking a look at how you use the rigorous approaches and the best practice methods for gathering data, collecting data, and analyzing data. So I think that they do serve a role, and I do believe that they can help our profession. And I think that when you partner them with someone who has the L&D background, who knows the science of learning, who knows the science of instructional design, I think that you then get a very powerful a powerful resource on the team that can kind of help pull that all together and use scientific methods that will help us use data in very smart ways.
Yeah, I almost wonder if it's their mindset actually that they bring almost above anything else of the way that you approach it in the first place.
Yeah, absolutely. If you have a history or if you have a background in data science, then you can certainly help with the approaches. And then, with all that rigor that goes into using data to come up with insights that help, us make decisions and inform our decisions as well.
Go on then, Owen. I feel we need a video podcast because your face is so expressive today.
No, I'm not sure what's changed. The Botox is worn off. I think the thing about having a data analyst in L&D is it depends on what size of learning function you've got. I think there is a risk that you absolve everyone working in learning and development in getting a bit more comfortable with data if you turn around and say, "Oh, let's just get an analyst in." I think everyone needs to up their game as far as that's concerned. What an analyst gives you is experience in collecting and analysing the data, particularly in complex environments. So they know the right kind of tools that you can use. They know the kinds of methods that can be used to collect data appropriately, the tools that you would use to analyse that data, what is meaningful in those large data sets. But there is a lot of low-hanging fruit in learning and development, and a little bit of nous with data will take you an awful long way in identifying things that work, things that aren't working, and it doesn't take much. In the vast majority of the time, the kind of data that you're collecting that will give you really strong evidence or clues as to whether something's working or not, all of that stuff can be done in an Excel spreadsheet. There's no need for people to use Stata or program in R to be able to analyze that kind of data, unless you're talking about genuinely, vast scale organizations. So it would be nice for a large L&D function to have, but I think if you were to turn around and say, well, we can't possibly do any of that data stuff because we don't have a data analyst in the team, that is just, that's making up an excuse for not just finding out a little bit.
Yeah, I would agree. You definitely don't have to have a data analyst on your team, but I believe what they do bring is all of that expertise and background and best practice that you talked about. So I wouldn't say that not having a data analyst on the team is going to prevent you from collecting the facts and the evidence and the data that we've talked about. I'll just say that having one on the team will certainly enhance that process.
Absolutely. They'll get 4 times as much work done in half the time when it comes to actually crunching the numbers. It's a massive efficiency. But we should be able to think in terms of what kind of evidence do we need to gather, what will that tell us, and what decisions were we going to make off the back of that. We should have that mindset already.
All right, let's leave it there with that harmonious ending, and we'll move on to our regular feature, What I Learned This Week, where we each reveal something we picked up over the past 7 days. Owen, what have you learned?
Well, this is actually a callback to our books episode, because I read...
I've got a book as well.
Oh, have you?
Yeah.
Is it one from the list?
No, it's not. It's a new one.
Oh, right. Okay. Well, in which case then. My one, I read Turn the Ship Around by David Marquette. So David Marquette, I think as we mentioned, he was a a nuclear submarine captain who turned around the USS Santa Fe, where the crew went from being the worst rated in the entire fleet to the best rated under his leadership. And it tells the story of how he managed that by encouraging a culture of genuine empowerment. And it was great. A really good, thought-provoking read with lots of provoking questions around how you behave as a leader and how that can impact on how empowered people feel, but also what you need to have in place for genuine empowerment to take place. So I came away from that with lots of questions about my own behaviour and to what extent I need to adapt that in order to create an even more empowered organisation.
I've already seen the impact of this when you insisted on being called captain.
Captain Owen.
I think commander I would prefer. I think I know that's not as high, but commander sounds better.
That sounds great. Kevin, what have you learned this week?
Wow. So I'm trying to, think of how I'm going to follow up to Owen, because what I've learned is much more of a fun fact, if you will. So what I have learned over the past 7 days is that I can survive for 24 hours without food. So last week I had to have some medical tests, and I had to fast for 24 hours. And it is the first time in my life that I have ever fasted. And so for me, prior to that, I've heard about people fasting and going without food for even days. And I just had to go without food for one day. And so what I learned is that I can do it. I also learned that it's not fun.
Yeah. So you've learned that you can do it, but given the choice, you won't do it.
I love food. Yes.
Cool. So I wanted to recommend a book, and Owen, I think you'll love it. I think you've heard of it. The Constellations of Physics by Tim Radford.
No,
it's got a
one to me.
Terrible tagline, Why the Wonders of the Universe Can Make You Happy, which I don't think he must have added because it's completely unrelated to what the book's about. But it's kind of a sort of broad overview of where we are with physics just now. If you're into Voyager and CERN and gravitational waves, I don't think there's anything new in it, but it's just really beautifully written. I wanted to read a passage, if that's okay. This is I opened a random page in Waterstones and then ran to the counter to buy it. So, the arrival of the Bronze Age is a story of the movement of peoples. The Bronze Age epics salute blacksmiths and celebrate swords, armour and valuable dishes, but the same stories also tell us that Europe and the Levant at the time represented a vast free trade zone with free movement of peoples, especially skilled workers dealing in products of high net worth. You couldn't deliver trusty bronze swords or ploughshares without testing the proportions of each metal that made the alloy you wanted, the one in the highest demand. So locked up in the idea of the smithy is the concept of trial and error, or to put it another way, scientific research and development. That gives you a sense of it. It's just really broad in scope and covers all sorts of great stuff. And I loved it. I read it in like a day and a half.
Well, is it basically why science is really cool and good?
Yes, it is, but it's also about why are we here, and it kind of looks at similarities between science and philosophy and theological approaches to these questions, and it just covers rakes of stuff. And that's it. That's all from us. If you'd like to get in touch with us about anything we've said on the show, you can tweet me at RossGarnerGP. You can tweet Owen
at Owen Ferguson.
And you can tweet Kevin
at Kevin M. Yates.
Lovely. You can also tweet at Good Practice or at Good Practice AUS, or visit goodpractice.com to find out more about who we are and what we do. We have our own library of podcasts you can try, and you'll find them all there. Kevin, do you want to plug anything else?
Sure. I'll just invite our listeners to take a look at my work on my website at kevinmyates.com. I'm also on Facebook. And as we said, you can follow me on Twitter. And you can learn a lot about me on my website, the work that I do, and what I'm passionate about when it comes to facts, evidence, and data for learning and development.
Great. Thanks very much for joining us today. And if you've enjoyed this show at home, please do leave us a review. It takes less than a minute and really helps us out. Until next time, bye for now.